Sorry for the cheesy intro, but I wanted to put us in the 1980s mood, since the 80s were the years when the synthesizers came up to dominate the world in terms of popular music. This video is pretty long, so I set cue points so you can go directly to your topics of interest. But in any case, I will not be talking of very little about electric pianos in this presentation, like Rhodes, etc. Nor drum machines, by Lynn, for instance, or samplers, whatever. Focus will be on main music synthesis techniques and their implementations on well-known iconic synths and how that happened. But iconic is a subjective term, and I will probably not mention all your favorite synthesizers here. For example, I will not talk about the EDP Wasp synthesizer, which was used to create the also iconic Sweet Dreams by Eurythmics. This video would have to be several hours or even several days long to mention all of them, and I'd probably miss a few of them anyway. Also, I will not go into much technical details in this video for the same reasons. For those interested, I made other short videos to explain the technical details on some sounds played in this video and produced by these synthesizers. But in any case, I believe this video will give you a pretty good idea of the music synthesis history and which major milestones paved the way from basic sound generation to today's sophisticated features in synthesizers. Okay, here we go. The first synthesizers were invented about 2,300 years ago. Yeah, because the first synthesizers were actually water pipe organs, and they were invented by the Greeks and used by the Romans as well. We'll see in a few minutes why we consider pipe organs as synthesizers, but they are the electronic synthesizer ancestors. And, well, they actually sounded like this. And then they gradually evolved into those majestic cathedral organs, using only air and reaching maturity in the 16th century. Now, why do we talk about pipe organs in a video about music synthesis? Well, because they introduced two main principles in musical instruments history, and those principles were to be fundamental to the invention of synthesizer. The first feature is the possibility to mix different sounds to create a particular timbre, and the second one is the ability to save the parameters used to characterize these timbres and to retrieve them easily when playing. Watch how Olivier Latry uses multiple pipes to create unique sounds by pulling some stop knobs, and listen to the result.
Différentes selon les cas, entre ça ou bien ça.
As you could see and hear, two different timbres of the same instrument could be retrieved using some mechanical machinery. In today's terminology, that would be called saving and reloading a preset. But the most important feature of pipe organs clearly is the first one, the ability to mix basic sounds, which means using several pipes for the same note to create much more complex sounds or timbres. Now let's see how this works. Here is a side view of a pipe organ. The blue, gray, and red stop knobs open or close an opening to different pipes. And by using knobs, you can use more pipes and therefore add more sounds for the same note pressed on the keyboard. And it's exactly the principle of additive synthesis in modern synthesizers. The fact that you can use the same instrument to create multiple sounds or timbres is a typical characteristic of synthesizers. Here the energy is mechanical while it's electric in a synth, but pipe organs can really be considered as synthesizers, or at least their ancestors, by generalizing the concept. For that, we need some simple math and physics principles, but don't worry, it will only take a couple of minutes and will give you a much better understanding of how synthesizers work. Okay, let's start with the basics. What is a sound? Well, it's a vibration of the air around us. For instance, when I speak, the vocal cords in my throat vibrate, and doing so, they push and pull air to and from my mouth, creating a sort of domino effect which will make the air vibrate at the same frequencies as my vocal cords. This vibrating air will reach the ear of a listener, that would be you, and more precisely your eardrum, and make it vibrate at the same frequencies. And this will eventually be converted to some electric current, and your brain will then interpret these electric vibrations. Similarly, a loudspeaker will play some music and its main membrane will vibrate, and the vibrations will eventually reach, for instance, a microphone membrane, which again will vibrate and convert that into electric current, etc., etc. So, a sound is a vibration. Now, how can we use that to create sounds? Well, physicists and mathematicians have an answer. First of all, what is a vibration? Well, it just is the repetition of the same movement. If we look at the membrane movement on the right, we can see that it goes from left to right and then right to left and back to its initial position. And then repeat that again and again and again. Here, this movement takes a bit more than 1 second for the membrane to get back to the same position. But if it was exactly 1 second, we would say it would be vibrating at a frequency of 1 hertz. And if it was vibrating twice as fast, it would be 2 hertz, etc. And for us to be able to hear the vibrations generated by a membrane like this, it would have to vibrate at a frequency between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, at least in theory. So, how can we use that information to create sound that people can hear? Well, let's start with a simple vibration, like this membrane vibrating at a fixed frequency. Look at the blue point on the top here. It corresponds to the center of the membrane moving over time. As you can see, it's a very smooth and regular movement. In mathematics, we get the exact same smoothness when a point moves on the perimeter of a circle, as shown by this arrow pointing to that point. And it will also get back to the same point on a very regular basis, because it's on the circle. And as you can see, there is an exact match between the blue point on the diagram and the curve on the left. This blue point is called the sine of the angle between the arrow and the horizontal axis. And that's why the curve on the left is called a sine wave. It's the simplest but also the most fundamental periodic function. And that leads us to our first rule to create sound. To create a sound, like a simple tone, we need to create a current of air, as for the organs, or of electricity, as in modern synthesizers, that will follow this curve, the sine wave. But what if we want more complex sound than a simple tone? Well, for that we need a second rule. It's a rule that's been defined by a physicist called Fourier in 1822. It says that any periodic signal is equal to the sum of sine waves whose frequencies are multiple of the fundamental frequency, which corresponds to the music note. And what that means is that you can create any constant sound by simply adding sine waves. And the first sine wave will have a frequency that will determine the pitch, like a note on a keyboard, and the other sine waves will have frequencies which are multiple of that first frequency, that is, the frequency of the main pitch. In other words, in a musical instrument, the frequency f of the first fundamental sine wave determines the musical note pitch, and the other sine waves at frequency 2 times f, 3 times f, 4 times f, etc., which are called harmonics or partials or also overtones, will define the timbre of the instrument. And that's what makes the difference between a C note on a piano and the same C note played on a flute. But, okay, enough theory, let's see concrete examples. Okay, these were pure sine waves. Let's see what happens with sawtooth waves. So as you could see and hear, the sawtooth wave is very rich. It has all the harmonics. So when you play an A note, you have the 110 Hertz sine wave, which means it's an A note. But then you'll have on top of that the 220 Hertz, 330, 440, etc. overtones that will create this sawtooth aggressive and powerful sound. Now, let's remove the even harmonics. In other words, let's keep the fundamental 110, of course, and then only add the 330, 550, 770, 990, etc. harmonics. And then what we get is a square wave. Now, I don't know if it sounded familiar to you, but this sound is typically the sound used in the first video games because it was very simple to generate, only two values to create the sound. Now, listen to these typical square waveforms and maybe it'll ring a bell. Okay, these were pretty basic waveforms. Now let's see what happens with real instruments. So yes, the 220 Hz sine wave is here to tell us it's an A note. And then we can see the harmonics just like Fourier predicted. Now let's try a flute. As you could see, there were less harmonics in the flute sound, which means that piano sound or timbre is more rich. Okay, we're now ready to attack the main subject, how music synthesis was created and evolved towards the electronic music synthesis we know today. It all started with a Russian called Lev Sergeyevich Theremin, better known as Leon Theremin, who was a physicist passionate about electricity and then electronics applications. In particular, he was working on a motion detector that emitted a sound when detecting motions, and noticed that the pitch of the generated tone was varying when he was approaching his hand to the apparatus. To make a long story short, this led him to invent a musical instrument which impressed none less than Vladimir Lenin. Yeah, the communist who created USSR. Who then sent him all over the world to promote his instrument as a proof of Soviet supremacy in technology. The instrument called a theremin was created in 1920 and was just using one antenna to vary the pitch of an electronic oscillator and another one to vary its amplitude, that is, the sound volume. It was essentially played by women, such as the virtuosa Clara Rockmore, because the sound was reminding that of a female opera singer, but also because it was very delicate and required extreme precision skills to play it. Here is an example by the great Hungarian violinist and theremin player Katika Eleni, playing Ennio Morricone music with a symphonic orchestra. Look at the precision of her gestures. Very impressive. And as we'll see, this instrument had a tremendous impact on the music synthesis history. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Electricity and its little sister electronics had a great impact on many inventors at the time. The Ondes Martenot, for example, was created by a French inventor who worked during World War I as a radio operator and who developed the Ondes Martenot thanks to its experience in military radio oscillators. It's been used by Maurice Jarre in the Lawrence of Arabia movie, and it sounded like this. On the other hand, the Trautonium was invented by German Friedrich Trautwein, who, along with his friend Oskar Sala, brought concepts like white noise, subharmonics, subtractive synthesis to music instruments, concepts still used today in modern synthesizers. The Trautonium is known to have been used to create bird sounds in The Birds movie by Alfred Hitchcock, and it sounded like this. As I said before, many other electronic instruments were invented around that period, as electricity and electronics were very inspiring technologies for these period inventors. But in the meantime, some other great inventors were working on instruments mixing classic mechanic with electricity. These new instruments also had some influence on the design of future synthesizers. Although not using brand new electronic devices, these inventors were very smart in using combinations of mechanical and electric parts to create new instruments, in particular to adapt a classic interface such as a piano or organ keyboard to play the new sound they created. The Hammond organ, for example, probably is the most popular instrument ever sold, since, depending on various sources, 2 to 6 million of these organs were sold during its lifetime and counting. It was based, however, on a 40-year-old invention called the Telharmonium, which was an incredible instrument, especially by its size and its weight. The main principle behind its technology was the use of so-called tone wheels, which are sort of discs with a given number of smooth bumps at the rim. These bumps generate a specific frequency as the disc rotates close to a pickup assembly that consists of a magnet and an electromagnetic coil, as shown in the diagram on the left here. So depending on each wheel size and number of bumps, as well as its rotating speed, various electric current could be generated at specific frequencies, thus generating tones corresponding to various notes, which is what we need, remember? A couple of those were built, generating music in real time, which was dispatched to listeners via the emerging telephone lines, thus inventing the first music streaming system. Yeah, here we see the front end. And here is the back end on the other side of the wall. Yeah, this little instrument weighed almost 200 tons. So I guess that was not a portable device. But anyway, some 40 years later, an American named Lawrence Hammond used the same principle, but at a much smaller scale, and created the famous Hammond organ with its specific and remarkable sounds. On the picture, it is shown with a Leslie cabin, which added to the legend by using rotating speakers to add an incredible tremolo effect to the Hammond sound. Listen to this sound playing the theme of a hit song of the late 60s called A Whiter Shade of Pale. But Hammond did not stop there. He also invented with a couple of friends the Novachord, a truly electronic synthesizer, which looked, well, like this. Yeah, this is an electronic synth using electronic lamps, capacitors, resistors, and all kinds of electronic gear available at that time. All this in 1939, yeah. And it also implemented very modern concepts still used today, such as envelope generators, Foreman filters, and a few other remarkable ideas, such as multiple oscillators and subtractive synthesis. And it was polyphonic. Yeah, that's right. You could play chords on a keyboard and hear strings-like performances with a pretty remarkable quality at the time. But unfortunately, its price, its fragility, 12 oscillators to keep in tune was a significant challenge at the time. And more importantly, the World War II, which created component shortage, All of this prevented it to get the success and fame it deserved. Listen to this. You see what I mean? It already had a lot of features you find nowadays in synthesizers, but this was 1939. Incredible. But as the electricity-based technologies evolved with time, some other inventors started to use another new technology, the electromagnetic tapes, which allowed to record and store any sound on a little piece of magnetic tape. The first person to do that was Chamberlin around 1950. Although technically quite impressive at the time, it was not very successful though, probably because Chamberlin wanted to use it exclusively for classical music, and well, its audience was not ready for that. It's worth noting that Chamberlin also invented the first drum machine, which also used magnetic tapes in 1949. It was called the Rhythm-Mate. But the idea of using tapes was reborn about 15 years later in the UK under the name Mellotron. Here again, simple instruments like flute, violins, or even choir voices were recorded note by note on small pieces of magnetic tapes and played back when the appropriate keyboard key was pressed. It still was a fairly complicated piece of hardware, but triggered a lot of interest among the new generations of musicians, including the Beatles and many other pop rock bands at the time. Here you can see a simplified schematics of the mechanical part used for each key to generate pre-recorded sounds of actual instruments note by note, which explains why it was pretty fragile and susceptible to failures at any time. Here is what it sounded like in the 60s when it was used by the Beatles and many other bands and musicians. But let's go back to Fourier theory and the use of electronics to create new sounds and therefore new instruments. You remember the Theremin, the first electronic instrument. As I said before, its inventor was sent by Lenin to show off abroad, and that included a trip to New York in 1928. His demos were well received, and he even made a deal with RCA to build and distribute it in the US. But for various reasons, and in particular 1929's economic crisis, it's been a business failure. But in the 50s, the project is resurrected via an electronic design magazine, which offers the schematics of a similar device as the Theremin. A young electronics passionate named Bob Moog. First, a quick note about Bob Moog's name. It's true that his wife preferred to pronounce it Moog, because she was a teacher and her students were mocking her name, comparing it to a cow mooing, believe it or not. And actually half of Moog's family pronounced it that way. But I'm used to pronounce it Moog, so during this presentation you might hear me saying Moog or Moog, but I'm talking about the same person. Anyway, so Bob Moog sees the Theremin schematics in the magazine, builds his own prototype, improves its design, and ends up selling it with some success as a student at the University of Columbia. He then decides to create his own business, and always looking for new ideas, realizes that electronics should allow for more than one sound to be generated, and starts designing many electronic boards to enhance the capabilities of his new sound machine. Each electronic board is called a module and includes many ideas from him and from previous inventors, which will end up being used by almost all synth designers from then on. So the Moog Modular Synthesizer, as it was called, looked like in this picture on the left. And by the way, this young gentleman is no other than Hans Zimmer with Joe Zawinul on the right picture. Around the same period, another American inventor, Alan Robert Pearlman, also known as A.R.P. or ARP, built his own modular synthesizer with similar but different ideas. Another company, EMU Systems, based in California, began producing their EMU modular system in 1972, but they are mostly known for their samplers. Also worth mentioning is the Bukla box, which was developed around the same time as Moog's modular synthesizer in the mid-60s. Well, as a matter of fact, Bukla commercialized the first modular synth a year before Moog. Yeah, but even if Bukla's box and the EMU modular system and A.R.Pearlman's A.R.P. synth were known to some electronic music geeks and specialists, it was Moog's design which was finally well known to the general public, for a reason that we are going to see right now. Ain't that exciting? Okay, so Moog was selling his invention piece by piece, so one could buy one electronic board or module at a time to achieve whatever the module is allowed to do. That's what a woman called, well, Walter Carlos was doing. Yeah, I know, Walter sounds like a strange name for a woman, but she officially was a man at that time, before she became officially and publicly Wendy Carlos 10 years later. Anyway, so she was a great piano and also organ player and a composer, and she also was always curious about state-of-the-art technologies, and in particular using electronics. But she was not very wealthy, so she had to patiently, little by little, purchase Moog's modules to create her own musical apparatus. As she was pretty creative, she eventually got in touch with Bob Moog himself, and they extensively exchanged on the module features, and she brought a lot of ideas to Moog for its modular synthesizer. So Moog decided to lend her one of his smaller modular synthesizers so that she could experiment with it. As a classical piano and organ player, Carlos got the idea to use it to play some of Bach's opuses and to use the synths to play all instruments. The problem was that there were not only several instruments to play at once, but they were playing chords as well. That means multiple notes at the same time, and Moog synths was monophonic, like most synthesizers at that time. So she built a multi-track tape recorder to be able to record each note for each instrument so that it seemed that several instruments, each with its own sound or timbre, were playing chords. It was a tremendous, tedious work to achieve that, but it worked. And she had a friend of hers, Rachel Elkind, listen to it. And Elkind liked it very much, and as she had connection with people at CBS, which produced a lot of music albums at the time, she offered them to produce a full album containing Bach pieces played by Carlos on the Moog's modular synth. Although not really convinced it would make a hit, on music charts, they finally accepted to produce a few thousand albums. But, against all odds, the album turned out to become very successful, selling more than 1 million of them, which, for a classical album was a world record first and would still be considered amazing by today's standards. And all of a sudden, not only musicians, but the whole public were discovering this new instrument capable of playing almost any type of sound, thus opening an enormous field of creativity in music. Here is an excerpt from the album. Now, of course, some loved it and some more conservative hated it, but it was a big surprise to all because nobody expected it to be musically so rich. All they had heard before were electronic and very abstract sounds, so it was a big shock to the general public. Now, to show you the versatility of the instrument, let's listen to various sounds played on it, using a few bars of Mussorgsky pictures at an exhibition. As a reference to the Emerson, Lake and Palmer eponym album. Here the same 8-bar notes are played using different sounds and played on an emulation of the original modular synth by Arturia, which sounds pretty close to the original. Now, as said before, the Moog Modular synthesizer was not the only one at the time. ARP, or A.R.P., had made a similar, although different product. It was, for instance, used by the Who rock band and its composer, Pete Townshend. But Townshend wanted to play chords on a new song called Won't Get Fooled Again, and the ARP, like the Moog synth, was monophonic. So he used an electric organ to play the chords and fed the organ output into the ARP synth's input to create a double effect, both rhythmic and changing the sound of the instrument in real time by using a low-pass filter modulation. Originally, Townshend used an EMS synth, but then switched to the A.R.P. He also used a Lorry organ, but the demo I made here to recreate the sounds uses a Hammond B3 and an ARP 2600 emulations. Now, of course, all the reproductions of songs I do in this video won't sound exactly as the originals, but that's mainly because I did not apply the mixing and mastering stages of production to the simple demos. But at least they show you how these sounds were actually created. Anyways, let's hear the thing. As you could hear, the ARP creates this rhythmic feeling while we play chords on the organ, and it also modulates a cutoff filter which creates this moving feeling by gradually and periodically removing higher frequency harmonics. Modulations, in the synthesizer jargon are variations of a given parameter. It's usually created by a low-frequency oscillator, also called LFO. The parameter can be the pitch of a note to create a vibrato, it can be its amplitude to create a tremolo, or in this case, a cutoff frequency of a low-pass filter. In fact, it can be anything, and this is a very powerful tool to make sounds evolve over time in a synthesizer. And modulations are keys to sound variations in all modern synthesizers. Okay, so now people knew that a new type of instrument with unseen-before capabilities existed to create sounds, and even new instruments and music. But the problem, as always, was that the instrument was very bulky and difficult to program and, very expensive. And that spark needed an explosive to really become the success they were expecting and to stay alive. So after selling a couple dozens of his synth, Moog, and in particular his engineers, felt that something had to be done to avoid bankruptcy. They exchanged a lot with people like, Walter or Wendy Carlos and Keith Emerson, and finally came up with a smaller fixed modular design. which would include the most characteristic features of the big dinosaur that modular synth was, without the complicated programming, the size, and, well, the price of the beast. And after more than a year of development, they came up with what really created the explosion they had been waiting for. The Mini-Moog. Here is what it looked like. All the main features of the big Moog Modular were available in this relatively simple form factor. And it was a hit, and thus triggered the interest of many American, Japanese, and European companies to build their own synthesizers. And that created a big boom in the field of musical instruments and modern music. Because now, not only were composers capable of creating new music, but they could create their own instrument. That means their own sounds to discover new music genres. Sky was the limit. But it unfortunately is also why classical musicians, or even classical in the broad sense music listeners, had a hard time to understand that music was not anymore about harmonies, chords, and melodies, but also about sounds. In particular, in electronic music genres, the same chord could be played over and over, but the sound could evolve, and that was becoming the interesting part of a song. And it also changed the way composers, now called music producers, were creating their songs. Most of their work consisted not just in composing melodies, but also preparing the sounds so that they could be played and evolve during studio recording sessions or live gigs. And it's amazing to see that the Mini-Moog structure is still applied now, even in most modern synthesizers, more than 50 years later. Here we have one of the most powerful modern synthesizers, a synth called Pigments by Arturia. And we can find, among many other new features, of course, the same building blocks as in the Mini-Moog. And this is true for almost all synths today, be they hardware or software instruments. Now let's have a quick look at these building blocks in a typical synth. First, the tuning section. Then the sources of all sounds, called oscillators, which, as we will see, or rather hear later, we can tune relative to each other to create particular effects. Then we can pick the types of oscillators and define how we will mix them. We can even add more sources, such as a noise generator. The next important section will be the filtering block, which allows to remove from rich sound, like the sawtooth waveform we saw before. We can remove from that rich sound some of its harmonics to create completely new sounds. That's the process called subtractive synthesis. And of course, the envelope shaper, which will define the shape of the wave, its attack, sustain, decay, and release, all that will open even more the palette of generated sounds. And finally, the modulation and output stages, which help to dynamically shape the sound in real time. So, for those of you who had the opportunity to watch, hear, and live the progressive rock revolution in the 70s, I recreated here an excerpt of one of the most iconic opus by a band called Yes, who made extensive use of their new instruments made available to them. Here I will emulate a Mellotron and a Mini-Moog as they were used by Rick Wakeman in the second movement of the Tales from Topographic Oceans album. Let's have a listen. Although Lawrence Hammond had created a polyphonic instrument, the Novachord, the first popular polyphonic synthesizer was Yamaha's GX-1 in 1973. It was in fact more an organ than a synthesizer, but it retriggered interests of synth manufacturers to shoot for polyphonic instruments from then on. But the real star that appeared at that time was Dave Smith's Prophet 5, which featured 5 polyphonic voices and a microprocessor. Dave was not only a very gentle and modest person, but he also was a genius who participated in, or even sometimes created, some of the most important milestones in music synthesis. One of these was the definition of MIDI, a hardware and software protocol that would enable all synths and all surrounding elements such as keyboards and computers to communicate with each other, whatever company was building it and all over the world. This was not just a technical challenge, but also a political one, as it's very rare to see that happen in a very competitive market, as it was at the time and still is. This was made possible by Dave, Tom Oberheim also, and some major Japanese players such as Roland's Ikutaro Kakehashi, as well as others, of course. The Prophet 5 was not only polyphonic and MIDI compatible, but it allowed to save the settings, a premiere, at least for popular synths, in the world of music synthesizers. For instance, in the Mini-Moog, a musician would have to memorize or take note of all the button positions to recreate the same sound they invented for a given song, and that was sometimes problematic. And some musicians actually used several Mini-Moogs during their live gigs that were pre-programmed before the shows. With the Prophet 5, you could store and save all the settings and retrieve them at will. A revolution, you know. And that plus the fact that the Prophet 5 sounded really good because it had a great analog circuitry made it an instant success, in particular during the synth's golden years from 1978 through the 90s. It was used in almost any music production at the time, along with Yamaha GX-1, the Roland D50, as we will see shortly. As an example, it was the bass and pad synth in Martenot's Like a Virgin, which was a huge hit at the time. You know, something like this. And here you are, a hit that will sell millions of records. Well, with the help of Martenot's multiple talents, of course. And this time, it was easy to save the sound settings and retrieve them instantly while keeping the quality of an analog synth. But it was obviously tempting to use the digital tools, namely the microprocessors and their peripherals and memories, to not only store and save presets, as Dave Smith did in his Prophet 5, but also to actually digitally sample sounds. You know, that means record and digitize them and play them back using a computer. That's what companies like Fairlight or EMU were doing in the late 70s, but they were not very commercially successful as these were pretty expensive solutions and not technically available for everyone either. Another company, PPG, created by German inventor Wolfgang Palm, also used digital samples, but organized them in tables, thus creating so-called wavetable synthesis. Although Max Matthews invented the concept in 1958 using a big computer, this time it was available in one musical gear. The idea was to split a single recording into many samples, accessible via lookup table, and to allow more flexibility to edit the recorded sounds. This is still very much used in modern synths, and we'll see more about wavetable synthesis later on. Okay, so far we've talked about analog, additive, and subtractive synthesis, analog modular synthesis, and digital sample and wavetable synthesis. In the early 80s, the Japanese company Yamaha came up with the idea of using an analog method called frequency modulation, or FM, and convert it to the digital world. In other words, by computing waveforms instead of creating them with analog components. FM had been invented years ago and was already used in radio equipment, but not to make music. Well, with the exception of a very particular gear, which I will talk about in a few minutes. And unlike the analog synthesis used so far, where some electronic components created a waveform, which was then filtered and modulated, The FM synthesis idea was to emulate 2 oscillators per sound and feed the input of the second one with the output of the first one, as shown in the diagram here on the left. Again, here called beta would be applied to the output of the modulator oscillator. And depending on the gain applied, you would get results similar to those on the diagram on the right. The result was interesting because it allowed to get more easily some waveforms which were more tricky to generate with the classic oscillators that were used in the previous synthesis techniques. In particular, it could generate enharmonics, which allowed the harmonic frequencies not to be stuck at multiples of the note frequencies, remember? And therefore creating varying timbres naturally. Okay, what does that mean? Well, if you hit a resonating bell, the sound or the timbre will be very particular and vary a lot in time, as opposed, for instance, to a pipe organ whose sound does not vary much when one key is pressed. This metallic or bell effect is very naturally generated using FM. And I will give you more technical details and examples in the associated technical videos that are or will be available in my channel. Anyways, the particular sounds of the GX-7 made it one of the most successful synthesizers and used in a lot of songs and movies and commercials music during the golden years of synthesis, the 80s, 90s. But before we listen to a typical example of the GX-7 use, I need to talk about another icon of the music synthesis history, the Synclavier. The first version of the Synclavier had been developed around 1978 at the Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. It was using FM synthesis, a license from Yamaha, and additive synthesis principles. But a second version, cleverly named Synclavier 2, was developed, which was more user-friendly. Well, although when you look at the dashboard, anyways. And this one was a bit more successful despite of its price that could go up to $200,000 depending on the options. So, to summarize, it was one of the most powerful synths ever built, but it was very expensive and difficult to program. Having said that, it probably influenced a lot of the future synth designers. In any case, another reason to bring it up here is an amazing story which I discovered only a few years ago, which links the Synclavier to one of the most popular songs of the most popular album of pop music ever. So, here is the story. In 1981, a record showing examples of Synclavier sounds, entitled Incredible Sounds of Synclavier 2, was released. I will play now an excerpt from that demo record. Listen carefully to the second sound example. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now remember, this was released in 1981 and Beat It was officially released in 1983. I tried to replicate it with this very true emulation of the original Synclavier 2 by Arturia again, and I did a few equalization on it. So yes, not only the sound, but also the introduction notes of one of the most popular pop songs ever was a plain copy of a demo record. But actually, the King of Pop did not realize it had been recorded like this on the demo album and thought it was just a bunch of notes played by one of his staff with a new synthesizer instrument. When he was told that it was not the case, he made a deal with the author of the record, Danny Yeager, who subsequently was invited to participate in the coming Bad album. Now, let's be honest, the final version sounds a lot better due to the talent of Michael Jackson, of course, and his sound engineers as well. So the Synclavier was quite ahead of its time, using additive synthesis and FM synthesis to generate sounds. But the real star that really made FM synthesis a success was, as said before, the Yamaha GX-7. As an example, I recreated one of the 1,000 examples of how it was used in popular songs or movie soundtracks in the 80s. Here is the bass line of Top Gun movie hit, Take My Breath Away by Berlin. Here again I will use an emulation by Arturia of the GX-7, which was, as said before, a fully digital synth. So the emulation is pretty close to the original. GX7 was not the only star during the synthesizer golden years. Companies such as Roland, Oberheim, Korg produced great synth around the same time period, and I'll let you recognize some of the iconic themes of pop songs using, again, some emulation plugins. So, by the end of the 80s, the trends were to design digital synthesizers. The synthesis itself was not making much progress because the hardware synths were still lacking processing power. Computers, on the other hand, were getting more and more powerful, and for the first time, a computer was capable of implementing granular synthesis. Oh, but what is granular synthesis, right? Well, it was invented in 1956. Remember, it was a time when synthesis mad inventors were playing with magnetic tapes. They were recording anything that was making a sound, cut and glued bits and pieces of magnetic tapes, and reorganized them to make them sound cool, like shown on these diagrams. That was called musique concrète, because it was also cool to use French words at the time. One of the popes of this technique was Yanis Xenakis, who was sometimes getting pretty interesting results. Well, most of the time. But it's only 30 years later that computers got sufficient processing power to do digitally what Xenakis did with scissors and tapes. And now, of course, these techniques can be implemented on any PC synthesizer software. Let's listen to one use case of this very powerful technique. Here we're going to play a piano sample and then use granular synthesis to cut it in pieces and play the various chunks, also called grains, hence granular, with different densities and hear what happens. This is just one example, of course, and granular synthesis can be used for many more applications, as we can see in other more technical videos I did in this playlist. Now, in 1988, computers were not accessible nor powerful enough for most musicians, and that's when Korg decided to create an instrument that would allow to do everything from sound design to recording of music sequences, a concept that was going to be called a music workstation. The Korg M1 was born. Some similar concept called the Prophet VS had just been developed by Dave Smith, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Basically, the M1 was combining non-unique features into a single hardware instrument. And with it, you were able to simulate real instruments, but also to add more synthetic sounds as well. And the success was tremendous, and it became the most popular synth ever made. Let's have a listen to some of its built-in demos. A few years later, Dave Smith was hired by Korg to lead their research and development department and created the Wavestation, another workstation based on technology that Dave had developed in his own company under the name Prophet VS. This technology, called vector synthesis, consisted in merging several waveforms or even several waveform parameters and mixing them using a joystick. That allowed to combine up to 4 parameters or 4 waves in real time, and also to create sequence of samples to be combined to create fairly complex sounds, as you can hear on the following piece of music. Now remember, all these sounds and rhythmic patterns were played in real time with a single preset that could be edited, rearranged, modulated in the Wavestation itself. Okay, we're now in the 1990s. Thanks to more and more powerful processors, another synthesis technique is going to be developed and implemented by Yamaha in its VL1 synthesizer. This technique, called physical modeling, consisted in simulating with mathematical equations all the characteristics of real instruments. For instance, you would take a trumpet and analyze the flow of air going from the musician's mouth through all the pipes and pistons of the trumpet, and take into consideration the metallic characteristics of the trumpet, and then recreate all that with math functions. Same thing with the violin, where the string vibrations would be simulated, and depending on how the bow hits the strings, what kind of vibrations it generates, and of course how it's resonating in the wooden violin body. This technique has been improved over the years, and I can't resist showing you the results you can get today with a mere music plugin in your PC. Now, by the mid-90s, something happened, as it does every time a new, more modern technology arises. Some people started to complain that these new generations of digital synthesizers were lacking the smooth and soft sounds of their analog ancestors. No problem, said synth builders, we will emulate the grandparents. In other words, some manufacturers chose to calculate and emulate the sounds of past generations and duplicate their flaws and non-constant characteristics, which supposedly were making the warmth and charm of these old pieces of gear. Among them, the Korg Prophecy and Clavia's Nordlied were pretty successful in recreating the sounds of their analog counterparts. To be honest, in 2024, all of this is done perfectly by a lot of software plugins. Talking about PC software, by the end of the 90s, Dave Smith created a complete synthesizer on a PC for the first time. It was not the best sound nor very user-friendly, as you can see, but at the time it was pretty impressive to have all these sounds capabilities available from a PC. And well, since then, PC hardware and software have considerably evolved. PCs and Macs have multiplied their performances by several orders of magnitude, including the amount of memory at their disposal. But not many new techniques have been developed in terms of music synthesis. Software synths just increase their performances, and modern software synthesizers now support multiple syntheses, include many filters, sound effects, oscillators, sequencers, arpeggiators, etc., etc. And you can create virtually any sound you want based on that. Arturia Pigments is one example of that. Oh, and by the way, I'm not linked in any way with that company, and I did pay for the plugins I use in this presentation. But I do like their plugins, as you can tell. Anyways, Arturia did so well in integrating both modern and old techniques in their flagship synth Pigments that they had to create a special clip to show that Pigments was also able to play very modern sounds, which had not much to do with the sounds of the 80s. I want to play this demo for you because I think there is a very good match between the visual and audio effects. Okay, to wrap up this presentation, I'd like to play a little game with you. We're going to create a very basic music sequence that's a remix of an old but well-known movie series. And for that, I'm going to use different sounds, each sound using a different synthesis technique. I will not go into the technical details of how I created or adapted these sounds, but I'll do that in a series of short videos. You'll find the list in the description text as usual. So, are you ready to guess which movie series I'm talking about? Haha, let's go. For all the sounds I use in this demo, I made a short video to explain how it's made. Just check the links below the video. The first sound is very interesting. It sounds like a sequence of percussions, but actually it's made from pure white noise. Yeah, you know, this type of sound. Interesting, isn't it? The second sound is similarly made using virtual analog oscillators, you know, like in the Mini-Moog. The third one uses a wavetable and a few other tricks. The fourth one is the only one using the built-in sequencer. The fifth one uses additive synthesis to start a pad. And the sixth one is a pad using Granular Synthesis. The next one is a simple FM bass. And finally, we use two sample engines. Okay, now let's play them all together. here you are, the 007 theme. To summarize, a lot of things have happened in the world of music synthesis since the Greek invented it about 2300 years ago. The advent of electricity and then electronics, so very clever and imaginative inventors create incredible instruments using mechanical, then electromechanical, electromagnetic, electronic, and finally computer solutions. Here is a list of features that you can find in a good software synth nowadays. No doubt it will continue to improve in the future. Speaking of the future, well, it seems that artificial intelligence might play a big role in the development of music, among other things. I want to be optimistic and see it as a new tool to increase the dimensions of music. For instance, to allow composers to define their style and compose their song, with AI allowing to generate multiple versions of their song with their style. Their fans would then pick the version they like. This is just one application example, of course, but in any case, I believe that artists will always be the source and machines will depend on them to be creative.